Hello and welcome back to my virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Now, today we're going to talk about problems in the early republic, as in what happens after the Constitutional Convention. Now, before we begin, do what I'm always going to ask you to do, which is hit pause on this video. Take a quick minute, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the top. Make sure as you go through this lecture, you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why for each key term, as well as be able to tie the terms together and to their larger historical significance. It will be very beneficial to be able to do so on future essays and projects. Now with that, let's begin. Now, the last time we actually met, which seems like forever ago, we were discussing what happens after the American Revolution. And of course, the very first government, of course, was the Articles of Confederation. And for all practical purpose, it was a pretty big failure. Namely because of the lack of the ability to raise taxes and lack of the ability to raise an army, both of which we gave you examples of when it came to Indian attacks in the West, as well as Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. And we kind of ended with we formed this new government. Now, it's been a while, so I'm going to recap a little bit of what happens at the end of the Constitutional Convention so we can reset up what's going on and what kind of problems we're really experiencing. So with that, let's get started. Now, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the delegates left at a stalemate. And largely the problem is, do you want a big government? Do you want a small government? Do you want power at the states level or power at the, central authority? And then if you do agree on that, how do you represent the states? And of course, we have those two big plans, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. And of course, each of them had their flaws. The Virginia plan was supported by big states because it gave representation based on population. And then, of course, the New Jersey plan gave equal representation. So what happens is the delegates, most all of them go home over the July 4th holiday. But a couple of delegates, namely Benjamin Franklin, stick behind. And over the July 4th holiday, Benjamin Franklin begins to hammer out a compromise that becomes known as the Great Compromise of 1787. And it has several important details and aspects that you all need to know about. First of all, this is our new government. This will frame our Constitution. So we start out, we have a lower house. This will be based on population. Now, this makes all the big states happy, like Virginia, because they will outnumber smaller states like, say, Rhode Island. Now, notice, though, there's a few things here that kind of tweak this so it's not quite as powerful as people like Virginia would like. Namely, they serve 2-year terms. That's the first thing. This limits the power of the House of Representatives because you're constantly having turnover. Secondly, notice this thing here, they only serve 2-year terms. Because remember, Alexander Hamilton feared, it had great disdain for the common person. And because the House will be chosen by the masses, the general population of citizens, the idea of these elites was that the common people will probably get it wrong a lot. In that way, you only have to live with it for 2 years. And hey, we're done, move on, someone new can join if they suck. Then we have the upper house, known as the Senate. And this would be equal representation, and they would serve 6-year terms. And again, because this is considered the elite house. These are your more elites of society. This was the way it was always designed. And of course, this will be based on 2 per state, equal representations, so that no one state, Virginia versus Rhode Island, they have some equal say in government with 2 equal branches, co-equal branches there. Then, of course, we have the president, which was a brand new office in this new Constitution. Now, this was something that did not exist in the Articles of Confederation government. But notice, though, that originally the president was only chosen by the Electoral College. It'll be 20 years before we ever see, actually closer to 30 years, before we ever see a real election where the average citizen votes. And again, this highlights the kind of disdain that many of the early founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton included, that had for the common person. They didn't trust them. And of course, we still have the Electoral College today, in large part because we don't want to have a situation where a state like California with such a large population basically nullifies the will of places like Montana and Wyoming, which is why you have a situation like 2016 where Donald Trump can lose by 2 million votes in the popular vote, but still win the election. And again, there's debates on both sides of that argument. And then, of course, there's also the Supreme Court, this independent, theoretically, separate branch of government that will consist of 9 members that will be appointed by the president, but the Senate will confirm. Notice, we don't want too much power in the hands of one man. Now, on the one hand, this new Constitution, this under the Great Compromise, it preserves some new powers for the new federal government. Namely, they can raise taxes, the central government. They can borrow money. They can regulate commerce between states, so nationally and internationally. They can conduct foreign relations, always important, and provide a military. So all those things that were faults of the Articles government, the new government can now do. The states are not allowed to do any of these things. On the other hand, though, this Constitution did something else that was very important, is it made a direct relationship between the American people and their government. A direct relationship between the American people and ultimately the president. So even though the people did not vote for the president immediately, the Articles of Government, as I told you, was a compact between the states. The Constitution is a compact between the American people and the government. This makes sure that every citizen is subject to these federal laws, to this taxation, but it also makes the government responsive to the people. And this kind of covers this idea of, remember the big fear of centralized power after or before the revolution. Now, what about the fear of too much power? Well, we create checks and balances, the separation of powers. The idea that Congress can, pass a law, but the president can veto it. Now, if there's enough members of Congress to overturn it, that can work too. The president can appoint a Supreme Court justice, but Congress has approval on this. The Senate has approval. The judicial branch has checks on Congress. The legislative branch has checks on the courts. Again, all these things were put in place so one branch of government cannot become tyrannical and assert too much power. So again, this was all done to assuage the fears of those people who felt that the Articles government was just fine, like Thomas Jefferson. On the other hand, there's one issue we've not talked about, and that's the issue of slavery. So what about slavery? Now, the interesting part is slavery is never mentioned in the Constitution directly. But yet, slavery in the debate over the issue of slavery is paramount when it comes to the Great Compromise. Because first of all, there was this whole thing of the slave trade, the international slave trade. And basically, Franklin's compromise said we will not discuss the international slave trade. So any potential ban on the international slave trade will be not even up for debate for at least 20 years. And we won't discuss a ban on slave imports until 1808. That's one part. The second part, more importantly, was this issue of representation. Remember, the House is based on population. Who counts for your population? Now, of course, if you're a small state like Rhode Island, you're telling Virginia, no. Those are slaves. Those aren't real people. Those are your property. They should not count part of population. They can't vote. Of course, Virginia says, oh, no. We love our slaves. They're just not quite fully human up to the level of whiteness yet, but we love them. They should count. And because, of course, big states want those numbers for population purposes, and small states do not, the compromise was, well, every slave will count as 3/5 of a person. Now, on the one hand, this is genius. It's a compromise, right? Neither side got what they wanted, but yet both sides kind of met in the middle. It makes sense. On the other hand, this is incredibly stupid and inhumane. You are literally saying that African American slaves are not really human. They're not even a real person. They're 3/5 of a person. So on the one hand, it makes logical sense as far as it's a compromise. On the other hand, you are putting it into writing that African Americans are not fully human, not really a person. You've devalued and deprived them of their humanity. They're just 3/5 of a person. And of course, this is a continuing trend in our history as African Americans are devalued. They are seen as less than. And of course, it builds up the idea of white supremacy, something we'll talk about as we keep going in this course. So even though that means that the slavery did not act meaningfully on the issue of slavery, it is there. And there's a reason for it. This was not the most pressing issue for delegates. The most pressing issue was, how do you create a new constitution and a more effective form of government? And basically it was kicking the can down the road to future generations, future politicians to decide, which of course we know will take about 80 years, and of course we'll have the Civil War. Now, once the Constitution is drafted in 1787, in large part thanks to the Great Compromise, it is signed by a majority of the delegates, but now the issue becomes, will states actually ratify it? And guys, this was not a foregone conclusion. It needs 9 of the 13 states to actually ratify this. And the reality is, a lot of people, despite the checks and balances, despite the compromises, there was still a great distrust that this was a beefed up central government with too much power. Now, to pass this, so even though he played very little part in the drafting of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton will be back, and he will play a big part in the early government. In this case, he plays a big part in getting it ratified. Because even though he didn't get what he wanted, he did believe in the potential of America. And he would be the leader of what's called the Federalist Papers. Now, these are a series of propaganda pieces that are written by various founding fathers. You see the numbers there. You see Alexander Hamilton wrote 51 out of 85. Again, he's the most prominent figure. James Madison wrote 29, and John Jay, who's the first Supreme Court first Chief Justice, John Jay, he writes 5 of them. But I like what Federalist 51 says here. It says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels governed men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government to be administered by men over men, the difficulty lies in this. You must first enable that government to control the governed. And in the next place, you must oblige it to control itself. A dependence upon the people is the primary control in the government. If men were angels, you don't need a government. But because men are selfish and men have issues, and again, I'm using the term men here, so they use, but people, therefore you need a government that can rule over them. But we want to make this government in a way that's responsive to the people. And so people like Alexander Hamilton are arguing, yeah, this is a beefed up government, but this government will be responsive to the people. And this reflects those, not only the revolutionary values, but reflects those Enlightenment values of what's called a social contract between the government and the people. In other words, government gets its power from the consent of the people, the consent of the governed. Now, as you see the stat there, by 1790, all but Rhode Island had finally ratified it, and it becomes the official constitution. But it was not without a fight, because, of course, even though people like Thomas Jefferson still did not believe in this, so Federalists gave in even further. Even though they didn't need to, they didn't have to, there was already enough protections there, these anti-Federalists, like Thomas Jefferson, who believed that the Articles of Government was just fine, they wanted some types of guarantees. And one of the genius parts of our Constitution is it's amendable. Congress can add amendments to it to change things, to add things that are necessary. In this case, they added what are called the first 10 amendments, aka the Bill of Rights. And basically, these were promised by the Federalists to be added as a way to assuage the fears of the Anti-Federalists. And of course, these are all rights that you should know very well. And of course, everyone knows number one, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. We're in Texas. We know number two, right to bear arms. But it begs some questions here. It says a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Does that mean the average citizen should be able to bear arms? Does that mean that they should have weapons that are equal or comparable to the U.S. government? Because surely the U.S. government would never use the power of the U.S. military against its people. Stick with me, guys. We'll talk about a lot of it this year. And of course, take 1302 and you'll have it again in the second half of the U.S. history. And again, you can go through all these and they're all very important. You should know them. But you can pause and read them for yourself right now. Nonetheless, ultimately, it is finally ratified. It goes into effect. And by 1788, we have a new government. Now, fantastic. We have a new government. Ultimately, Anti-Federalists, they've been unfairly characterized over the years, and partly because they're named anti, right? They've been kind of unfairly depicted, I think, as country bumpkins who seemed out of touch with the future of American governance. And the reality is that's not true. They share the same revolutionary ideology that the Federalists did. They shared everything. They believed very similarly to the Federalists. What they did have a different disagreements on is that the culmination of the revolution was the American Constitution. Because Anti-Federalists felt it went too far and took away the rights of individuals. In other words, both Federalists and Anti-Federalists shared a common belief that America was destined to be great. They just disagreed on the right way to get there. And you see, the Bill of Rights was kind of that compromise once again to get the deal done. So hey, we have a new compromise. It's worked out, we have a new constitution, it's sent to the states, and it's ratified, and we will have our very first president, George Washington, 1788. He's inaugurated in 1789. But this period from 1789 to 1800 represents a very key moment in U.S. history, especially in the political process. Because it is the development during this 12-year period here, between 1788 and 1800. It's a key moment in the evolution of American political history. It develops the idea of what's known as loyal opposition and the emergence of political parties. Because both sides are they're going to spring from the idea of Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. And they're going to spring up, again, both sides believe in the future for America. Both sides want what's best for America. Both sides wants what's best for the American citizens. They just disagree on the best course of action. So how do things begin? Well, it's rocky. I mean, look at the title of this lecture, Problems in the Early Republic. It's rocky. Let me give an example. Alexander Hamilton, Mr. Federalist himself, he's back. And even though he doesn't have much impact on the drafting of the Constitution, he's going to play a huge impact not only in the Federalist Papers, but also in the new government. Because Hamilton's going to serve as George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury. And Hamilton is going to have a huge impact on government while in this role. Hamilton believed the new Constitution was not strict enough. It didn't give the government enough power. He wanted more. And so, in addition, Hamilton wants to put his stamp on this new government and make a name for himself. Hey, maybe someday they'll make a play after him. He wants to make the government stronger. He wants to make the government not only beef it up, have more power, but also make him a stronger influence in the world. Now, as Secretary of Treasury, his main chief responsibility was the financial reputation of America. And he wants to convince the world that America is a financially responsible country. In other words, he wants to prove to the world that the United States of America is a safe place for your money to invest. Remember, we're a weak new country. We've already had one bad government. We're surrounded by enemies on all sides of us. And remember, we have debt. So he wants to convince the world, and of course Americans, wealthy Americans, that this is a safe bet. This government is here to stay. So let me give an example of this. So he says we have a lot of debt in this country. And of course, I'm sure like many of us today, we all have lots of debt. You have student loan debt. You have a car payment. You have taxes you owe. You have a house payment. You probably have to pay for your books this term. You have to pay for your new TV set you bought on credit card. We have lots of debt. Everyone's got some debt. Well, this new country of ours, the United States of America, had debt. What kind of debt? Well, we had national debt. We owed Great Britain. We owed France. We owed Spain. We owed pensions to war veterans. Remember the Shays Rebellion. We have state debt. States owed their militias. States owed the government. States owed their officials. States owed pensions. We have individual debt. And so what Alexander Hamilton wanted to do was to take all this massive debt, state debt, federal government debt. He wanted to combine them into one massive lump sum and pay it off together. By doing this, it would prove, in his mind, that we were a financially sound country, worthy of investment from other countries and from wealthy Americans. So who's with me? Who thinks that, let's just take our class for instance, who thinks that we should take our 20 people in our class, me included, let's combine it all together, all of our debt, and we'll pay it off together equally? What? No takers? Oh, you mean you don't want to have to pay off my house debt when you live in an apartment? You don't want to pay off my student loan debt because I have a PhD? You don't want to pay off my car payment because you were financially responsible and I was not? Yeah, that's a little problematic. I don't think anyone would want to agree to that. And quite honestly, Americans were not happy with this. So Hamilton proposes this. And of course, he has the wonderful quote about, we will all work together. The problem? Some states have more debt than others. Some states have said, hey, no. We were responsible. We already paid off our debt. Why are you trying to do this to us? But he says, I don't care. Remember, he has disdain for common people. He's a very elitist person. He says it doesn't matter what you think, because the new government has the right to tax, something our government could not do. And he became a tireless advocate for the development of American manufacturing, American trade, and American banking. Funny part was, a lot of stuff does become law. Again, the first banking system, National Bank, is there. But he also has a lot of chief critics. And his number one chief critic was the Secretary of State. So remember, he's Secretary of Treasury. The Secretary of State, though, of course, was Thomas Jefferson. And this really begins the birth of the first party system, this idea of loyal opposition. Was it really that Jefferson hated America and Hamilton loved it? Was it really that Hamilton hated America and Jefferson? No, it wasn't. They were loyal opposition to each other. They both believed that America could be great. The question was, how do you get there? Hamilton believed in big government, combine the debt, have these national programs, use the federal government to make America great. Jefferson believed in small government. He believed that states should have the power because they're more locally, and they can deal with their populations well at a more ready basis and be more responsive to them. And so he becomes the leader of a new political party known as the Democratic Republicans. Anti-Federalist was out because it just sounds bad. They're anti. So they renamed themselves Democratic Republicans, and of course then you have the Federalist Party. So what was the issue here? So Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson hates the Federalist Party. He sees what Hamilton's doing as a threat to liberty. He's taking away individual rights. He's compiling all this debt. He sees that Hamilton's policies are, quote, flowed from the principles adverse to liberty and was calculated to undermine and demolish the Republic, unquote. He sees Hamilton's fiscal program, combine all the debt together, as likely to promulgate the exact corruption and concentration of power they had fought to end from Great Britain. Now, did Hamilton really believe this? No. Loyal opposition. So what does it come down to? Who's right in this? Does Hamilton have the right to do this? Or is Jefferson right? Is this just corruption? It all boiled down to one small part of the Constitution that became known as the General Welfare Clause. So here's you see on your screen here. It's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, excises, etc., shall be uniform throughout the United States. So in other words, you can't make Virginia pay more money than Rhode Island. They'd be uniform. So does this clause give Hamilton the right to tax and combine all the debt? Now, on the one hand, yeah, he can tax people. That's not for debate. The question is, can he combine all the debt? And Hamilton says, well, yes, because he says it is in the general best welfare of our nation to do this. The General Welfare Clause, according to Hamilton, states that in his mind, states that the government can do what's ever in the best general welfare of our nation. Jefferson argues, no. That's taking this way out of context. This becomes known as strict versus loose interpretation of the Constitution. And so Hamilton believes in what's called loose interpretation, because he says general welfare, well, that can mean almost anything I want to make it. And it's exactly what Jefferson says is the problem. What if you take it to make it to where you essentially become a king, a monarch? So he believed what's called strict interpretation. If it says it, you can do it. If it's not directly written, you can't do it. This becomes the debate for much of our first 30 to 40 years of our government. Do you believe in strict versus loose interpretation? And how much power should the federal government have? In many ways, it'll continue being a problem for, well, till the present day. So both parties share this certain logic. The Federalists were convinced the Democratic Republicans were corrupt, devious, and bent on destroying the American liberty and American country. And the Democratic Republicans were convinced the Federalists were corrupt, devious, and bent on destroying American liberty and U.S. government. Both parties claim to be the true inheritors of the American Revolutionary legacy. But don't forget, right now, who's in power? Federalists. And so initially it does seem that Hamilton's party policies will win out. But there will be some attacks against those policies. We'll talk about that in our next lecture. So we're going to stop here. We'll come back with part 2 of this lecture next time. But until then, bye-bye.